So the Northeast Maglev project is a project that would utilize Japanese superconducting magnetic levitation trains on the US Northeast corridor. So that technology is quite different from conventional high-speed rail technologies in that the trains actually levitate. They don't run on wheels, on rails. They utilize very powerful magnets for both levitation and propulsion. Well, without a doubt, the major benefit of this technology is the speed. So maglev, the superconducting maglev, operates at a cruising speed of 311 miles per hour. So if we were to deploy this system on the Northeast corridor, you could get from Washington, D.C. to New York City in under an hour, which is a transformational time savings. If you fly typically with check-in and security, that's a 3-hour proposition. Driving is, who knows, 5 hours on a good day. And of course we have the Amtrak Acela, which is an excellent service, but that is 2 hours and 45 minutes. So maglev would really offer a very substantial time savings to the existing modes on the corridor. Well, we have very, very good support from various quarters. We've conducted polling in the Washington, D.C., Baltimore region, which is where we envision the first phase of our project being executed, and overwhelmingly people are supportive of maglev. They recognize the potential for the economy, for themselves, for the mobility improvements. We also have tremendous support from the Japanese government. The Japanese government has pledged to provide very significant financing for the project, which is really critical and very unique, I think, among the various high-speed rail projects that are being contemplated in the United States. And we also have great support from the US federal government. In fact, to date, the US federal government has committed over $50 million in federal grants specifically for this project. Well, these are still early days in terms of the development of the project, and there's still a lot of decisions that will have to be made that will affect the cost, including very typical things like where the station's going to be, will they be below ground, above ground, and so forth. So those will alter the cost dramatically. But for the first segment, Baltimore to Washington, we like to say that it'll be north of $10 billion. How much north of $10 billion will depend on those decisions. I don't like to forecast what the full corridor to New York will entail. That's a much longer term proposition. We're really focused right now on this first phase, DC to Baltimore. But north of 10 billion, we are going to be looking for public funding from the federal government. So some mixture of grants and loans from the US federal government, and probably some financing from the Japanese government. So some combination of those three sources of funding, US funding and financing and Japanese financing, to pay for this first segment between DC and Baltimore. So this technology has actually been developed in Japan since 1962. It is operating today. The system, the maglev train in Japan, some people think, oh, it's sort of a concept or a prototype. It's emphatically not. It is operating today. The public can buy tickets for this train. The train has operated, I think, more than 2.5 million miles, and over 300,000 people have ridden it. So this is a proven safe technology. It's been completely validated by the Japanese government. I would also point out JR Central, which operates this train, is the world's first high-speed rail operator. They've been operating systems, the high-speed rail Tokaido Shinkansen since 1964. They've never had a passenger fatality due to an accident in that entire time. They move about 150 million people per year and have an average annual delay per train of less than 1 minute. So this is the gold standard in safety and reliability, and that's what we propose to bring to the United States. Well, needless to say, a large infrastructure project does have impacts on the environment. That goes without saying, but we're taking very proactive measures to minimize those. So among the really important things I would point out, we have designed this first phase of the project between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore to be about 70% below ground. And we did that to not only avoid impacts on the environment, but also to avoid impacts to residential communities. It's a very dense urban area. So that's one really key thing that we have designed into the project to minimize environmental impacts. There will be other environmental impacts. We are going through a process right now with the US federal government, an environmental impact statement that's looking holistically at all of the impacts of the project and looking at ways to mitigate those impacts. And once we conclude that process with the federal government, we will be required, of course, to implement those mitigations to minimize the effects on the environment. Well, we think the project will have a really profoundly positive impact on highways. Actually, our target market that we're trying to penetrate is the auto market. And Washington, D.C. to Baltimore is one of the most congested highway corridors in the entire United States. So our project, we're forecasting ridership for our project to be over 20 million people by our kind of horizon year 2045. Of those riders, we estimate that about 16 million of those will be people who are diverted from automobiles. So those are people who otherwise would have made the trip, but by the availability of maglev, they've chosen not to use their automobiles and to use maglev to make that trip. So that has profound impacts on the highway system. It reduces maintenance costs, it reduces fatalities, and it reduces congestion. And just to give you an example of how profound these impacts are, there are estimates that in the Washington, D.C. region alone, people we collectively lose about $6.3 billion per year just in productive time that's lost sitting in congestion. And so by diverting a large proportion of those people who otherwise would take their automobiles to maglev, we're significantly returning that money basically to the traveling public, to the tune, I think, of about $700 million per year. So it's an absolutely staggering amount of money. In terms of airports, what we're proposing is actually having a maglev station beneath the main concourse area of Baltimore Washington International Airport. So we have excellent cooperation with that airport. They obviously are very excited about the prospect of having a maglev train that can deliver passengers directly to the concourse area. And our concept, as we extend the system up the corridor to New York City, is to connect city centers and airports. And that really underpins the vision for the project. So up the corridor, DC to New York, with stops at all the major city centers and all the major international airports. Well, they're profound. I mean, a project of this magnitude, there are various estimates for every $1 billion invested in infrastructure, you create X number of jobs. And what the US federal government has estimated for this project is that during the construction period alone, it'll create more than 200,000 jobs. Those are one job per person per year. So it's a huge, huge impact just through the construction. There's also going to be tremendous labor earnings from this. About $8.8 billion, I think, is the estimate for labor earnings. So that's it's a huge amount of money coming into the regional GDP that then is reinvested in to consumer goods and professional services and all these kinds of other sectors. So it really lifts up the economy of the entire region. So we work intimately with Japan Central Railway, which is the owner and operator of this technology. In fact, they have 2 representatives from their company working in our office in Washington, D.C. to give us technical guidance. We travel to Japan multiple times a year. I've ridden the maglev many times. We bring representatives of the US federal government, local governments to come to Japan to learn about the technology. So really what we want to do is, to the maximum extent possible, replicate the technology and the operating procedures that have proven to be so successful in Japan, replicate those in the United States. So I think the next big step for us is going to be completing our permitting. So that includes environmental permitting, wetlands permitting, various other types of construction-related permitting. I think that'll take a few more years, 2 years, it's hard to say, but in the foreseeable future we'll complete those steps. And then we'll be able to segue into final design and construction. We think that'll take roughly 7 to 10 years, and at that point, after the system is certified by the federal regulators, we'll be able to begin revenue service. So knock on wood, 2030 or so, give or take, we'll be able to offer you a ticket to ride the maglev in the United States.